This video is an explanation of the reading comprehension passage about the Ninth Amendment. This could be watched in conjunction with any question about the passage, and of course each question is explained in its own video explanation. I will say if you're doing several questions in a row about this passage, please do all the questions first before watching this video, and that way you'll be answering all the questions with your own understanding of the passage. So here's the beginning of the passage. Most educated people of the 18th century, such as the Founding Fathers, subscribed to natural rights theory, the idea that every human being has a considerable number of innate rights simply by virtue of being a human being. When the U.S. Constitution was sent to the states for ratification, many at that time felt that the federal government outlined by the Constitution would be too strong, and that the rights of individual citizens against the government had to be clarified. This led to the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, which were ratified at the same time as the Constitution. The first 8 of these amendments list specific rights of citizens. Some leaders feared that listing some rights could be interpreted to mean that citizens didn't have other unlisted rights. Toward this end, James Madison and others produced the Ninth Amendment, which states, "The fact that certain rights are listed in the Constitution shall not be construed to imply that other rights of citizens are denied." So that's the first paragraph. Very, very interesting. So it's a lot about this discussion of human rights, and this is based on ultimately on this 18th century thought, natural rights. These rights were put into the Bill of Rights because they thought that the U.S. government the federal government would be too strong and that it would be violating people's rights. And so one thing they did in the first 8 amendments, they listed out individual rights that U.S. citizens have. But then the worry was, what if we create a list and then people think, well, the only rights you have are on this list. And if it's not on this list, you don't have it. And that was not the intention of listing the amendments. They weren't trying to create an exhaustive list of every possible right. And so that's why they wrote the Ninth Amendment, so that the other amendments wouldn't be read as an exhaustive list, so that you couldn't say, well, if it's not said here, then you definitely don't have the right. So that's a tricky idea here. Now the second paragraph. Constitutional traditionalists interpret the Ninth Amendment as a rule for reading the rest of the Constitution. They would argue that Ninth Amendment rights are a misconceived notion. The amendment does not by itself create federally enforceable rights. In particular, this strict reasoning would be opposed to the creation of any new rights based on the amendment. Rather, according to this view, the amendments merely protect those rights that citizens already have, whether they are explicitly listed in the Constitution or simply implicit in people's lives and in the American tradition. So, in other words, the traditionalists don't think that we're going to get any new rights from the Ninth Amendment, that all it is a rule for interpreting the Constitution. By contrast, the more liberal interpreters of the Constitution have a much more expansive view of the Ninth Amendment. In their view, the Ninth Amendment guarantees to American citizens a vast universe of potential rights, some of which we have enjoyed for 2 centuries, others of which the Founding Fathers could not possibly have conceived. These scholars point out that some rights, such as the voting rights of women or minorities, were not necessarily viewed as rights by the majority of citizens in the late 18th century America, but are taken as fundamental and unquestionable in modern America. Well, those rights, the voting rights of citizens and minorities, well, those rights cited are protected specifically by other amendments and laws. So it's very important that the voting rights of women and minorities, that example is not an example of something protected by the Ninth Amendment. They're protected by other amendments. That's a very important detail. Well, those rights are protected specifically by other amendments and laws. The argument asserts that other unlisted rights could also evolve from unthinkable to perfectly acceptable, and the Ninth Amendment would protect these as yet undefined rights. So notice we don't get a single example in this whole passage of what these liberals would call a Ninth Amendment right. It's all hypothetical. And so there's a lot about the Ninth Amendment that is very hypothetical, both in its creation and even in the interpretation of the liberals who say there are Ninth Amendment rights today. We're only getting we're getting hypotheticals. We're not actually getting real examples of what a Ninth Amendment right would be.